Hi, this is Alice. Our featured guest this episode has one of the most recognizable voices in the world.
Most of the world does believe and knows that the Taliban were a very close product of your country. Do you regret that? And 20 years later, do you wish your country had done something different?
A few days ago, Christiane Amanpour had Pakistan's former ambassador to the UN on her show, and things got a little prickly.
I can understand the instinct to blame somebody for what has been a US-led Western debacle in Afghanistan. 20 years of a war waged by the most powerful army in the world led to the outcome that you have seen.
Christiane Amanpour has never shied away from a tough question, and whether she is doing an interview in the studio or is covering a war as the bullets fly overhead, she comes wildly prepared. Always. It is why she is one of the most important journalists of the past 4 decades. Her profession, she says, demands no less.
Journalism is a fundamental pillar of democracy and civil society. And therefore, if you don't have a healthy journalistic profession, class, etc., then you don't have a healthy democracy. And you can see that playing out right now, whether it's from Hungary, on the outskirts of Europe, all the way north, south, east, and west. There really is a difference in the world between truth and lies. And one is freedom and the other is dictatorship. And I think that people who come into this really need to understand that it's a phenomenal opportunity. I would always encourage people to take this up because it is foundational to the health of our civilization.
Christiane Amanpour is our guest on this episode of What It Takes, a podcast about passion, vision, and perseverance from the Academy of Achievement. I'm your host, Alice Winkler.
Academy, this child is gifted. And I heard that enough that I started to believe it.
If you have the opportunity, not a perfect opportunity, and you don't take it, you may never have another chance.
It all was so clear. It was just like the picture started to form itself.
There was no way in which a lie could prevail over the truth. Darkness over light, death over life.
Every day I wake up and decide, today I'm going to love my life. Decide.
My advice is, if they're going to break your leg once when you go in that place, stay out of there.
And then along come these differential experiences that you don't look for, you don't plan for, but boy, you better not miss them.
Mary Jordan, as you know if you're a regular listener to this podcast, is a political correspondent for the Washington Post by day. Fortunately for us, she also makes time to do interviews for the Academy of Achievement. A couple of weeks ago, she flew to England for a face-to-face conversation with Christiane Amanpour about her extraordinary life and her groundbreaking career.
So we're here in West London in your lovely home, and you gave us big news this summer, very recently, that you had ovarian cancer. And that news went right around the world because you're one of the most recognized journalists. Everyone knows you in every language. It was interesting. You were very just straightforward. You said, okay, I've got this. I've had surgery, and I'm going to beat it. What was that like, delivering that kind of news?
Well, what I didn't do was channel my inner warrior queen. I think most people look at me as some kind of, frontline journalist, which of course is what I am, and likes to project how you're going to react to what comes at you. So what I did was tell people, in the interest of transparency, why I'd been off the air for 4 weeks, having undergone major surgery, which was successful, to remove ovarian cancer, and then having started a period of chemotherapy, which as we speak, I'm still undergoing. And that is essentially an insurance policy to make sure this doesn't come back. And I wanted to be humble in the face of an illness that I can't control, that nobody else can control, that just by sheer, I would say, luck, I felt pain. I recognized that it was abnormal. I went to my doctor. I did everything I needed to do to investigate this and get it sorted out. And I was very fortunate, and I touch wood all the time, that I detected it early and that my medical doctors are extraordinary and they removed it successfully, that it has not spread, and that they believe that I will be cured.
On the air, Christiane Amanpour ended her succinct, candid announcement by explaining why she had decided to come forth, and it should have surprised no one who's followed her long reporting career that she felt a duty to inform.
I'm telling you this in the interest of transparency, but in truth, really mostly as a shout out to early diagnosis, to urge women to educate themselves on this disease, to get all the regular screenings and scans that you can, to always listen to your bodies, and of course, to ensure that your legitimate medical concerns are not dismissed or diminished. So that's my news. Now let's get to the news.
Weirdly, for a while, maybe it lasted about 24 hours, I went, hang on, I've spent my whole life confronting life and death in the field and escaping, where many of my colleagues have been wounded and killed in action.
Literally, you have been in a room where bombs exploded next door, right? Snipers have killed people all around you. So how is it different?
It's different because it's not the same. One is you put yourself there as a journalist and you take a decision that is based on either your deployment by your bosses or your own cost-benefit analysis, your own appetite and experience of risk, your own mission for, what you're doing. And the other is something that just befalls you. You can't control an illness, and it's very different. But I think it causes, maybe particularly at my age and my stage, it causes perhaps a similar introspection about what life is, what the future is, what your mission on earth is, and how you conduct yourself. That's been important for me to realize.
What is Christiane Amanpour's mission?
Well, I would say I have been at CNN as we speak 38 years. And I started at the very bottom and I climbed my way up because I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And I knew from the very beginning I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. Why? Because I wanted to tell those stories. And I wanted to witness what was happening in the world and be able to explain to people in a way that hopefully made them care about what was going on in the world. Some of that comes from my own experience because I experienced a revolution in Iran in 1978-79, which turned my life, my family's life, my country's life, and the world upside down. The first Islamic revolution in modern times in Iran.
So you're born in Tehran?
Nope. I was born in England. My mother's English, and she had all of us children in England. Very sensible of my grandfather, my British grandfather, who said to her, obviously being very prescient about immigration all these years later, if you want your children to have dual nationality, come to London, have the kids in the UK, and then they'll be, dual Persian British citizens, which is what I am.
And then you went back as a little baby.
Yeah. So we were raised in Iran, and that was my home, and remained my home until the revolution all those years later. But my mother, British Catholic, decided that the secondary education, potentially particularly for girls, I'm not sure whether she thought about girls or whatever, but the secondary education there was maybe not up to or along the lines that they wished for us, for their kids. And like many foreigners in different lands, they sent their kids back to boarding school. So I was one of those. At 11, I was sent to a convent in the UK and spent from 11 till 18, so my secondary education at convents in the UK.
In case you were wondering how this unusual family came about, Christiane Amanpour's mother was an intrepid adventurer who, as a young woman, traveled to Tehran by car, which is where she met Amanpour's father. Christiane Amanpour says despite the political upheaval they later lived through, her childhood was happy and secure. Her mother's moral compass pointed in the direction of black or white, seldom gray, and that's very possibly what led her, Christiane, to do her work with a sense of moral cause, whether covering Bosnia, Rwanda, Afghanistan, or our global climate catastrophe. But while she now has an almost iconic stature as a war correspondent, let's not forget what the world of television news was like when she entered it and found success in the early 1980s.
if you want to be on TV, you have to be young, you can't have a wrinkle, and it would help to have puffy blonde hair. Did it even surprise you?
Well, interestingly, when I first came out of college and I wanted to be, you see, in the United States, when you come out of college, you have several routes if you want to be a television journalist. You can either go to a very, very, very small market and be a reporter on the air and move up that way, and then perhaps move from market to market, and maybe if you're lucky, get to a medium size and then a big and then a national, etc. So I thought that's what I should do. Always the concept was to start at the bottom and to work my way up, because I don't believe in shortcuts. I don't think there are shortcuts. And shortcuts actually are bad for you as well as for everybody else. But I couldn't, because I didn't have the right accent, I didn't have blonde hair, I didn't have blue eyes, and that's what was predominantly on American television in the early 80s, as if you're a woman.
And when you got one of your first internships, you were literally doing graphics of weather in Providence, Rhode Island, where you went to college. Mm-hmm. You didn't do a good job. You got called out.
I thought I did a great job.
Clouds on a sunny day.
Yeah.
But some people would have thought, maybe I'm not so good at this.
Well, I knew I didn't want to do electronic graphics, so I wasn't too upset that I didn't do so well doing electronic graphics, although it was embarrassing because it was the weather guy who was a guy and slightly older, and for whatever reason he thought it was cool to embarrass me on the air. But again, it was a big lesson, because I'm sitting in the control room, and anybody who knows television and this whole thing, the control room is the nerve center of a nightly newscast, whether you're in local news, whether you're in national or international news. You've got the director, you've got all the producers, you've got the audio people, you've got the graphics, you've got all these people focused on one thing, and that's getting it right on the night. Occasionally I got it wrong, and he would call me out. But you know what? I don't mind being called out. I found it a part of the job. I found it, it was kind of character building, and it also meant that I learned on the job, and a
lot of people get knocked off their game by a small thing. A lot of people. In fact, I know quite a few people who say, I'm just afraid to go into TV because with social media, one little mistake will be blown up. That's what I'll be remembered for. But you, just even looking at you today, you just have this confidence that you're going to come back. Where does that come from?
Well, first and foremost, I didn't have to grow up in the social media world, which is a killer. And it's a grotesque world for young people to have to grow up in, because it's a false, it's a false denominator and marker of your competence, of your experience, or whatever. You can, as you say, make one tiny mistake. That everybody makes mistakes, but in a certain political environment or a certain, focus on this one thing, Twitter or whatever it might be, can have an exponentially negative effect that is unreal. It's an unreal effect. And everybody makes mistakes. And as we're young, we should have the experience, or rather, as we're young, we should have the opportunity to make mistakes and learn from mistakes. So first and foremost, I'm very glad I didn't grow up in that, in that petri dish of social media. In terms of confidence, I think it comes with competence. And I know that I'm good at what I do. I know that I've become good at what I do. I don't think I'm perfect. I'm not arrogant. I don't swan around like lording it over anybody. But I know that I've worked hard. And I know that I've learned enough and been around and done the real thing and been in the field and eyewitness and taken those risks and been, it's real what I've done, along with many, many of my colleagues. So that also gives me the confidence. And in fact, I was listening. I think this is very important about journalism. I was recently listening to a podcast in which Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones were interviewed, and as you know, they're taking up journalism positions at Howard University under some controversy, but with a huge amount of potential. And Ta-Nehisi was asked about, or commented on, the role of journalists. And he basically said, I'm going to paraphrase, no matter how privileged you are, no matter what a great education you've had, no matter what opportunities you've had, that is not what makes you a good journalist or a competent journalist. That comes with having done it. There's nothing to compare or substitute for being in the field and having walked the walk. And that's what I have.
But let's go back and pick up the story here for a moment of how Christiane Amanpour finally was able to get that field experience, despite the roadblocks that threatened to derail her dreams early on. Her first big break came thanks to some supportive colleagues at WJAR in Providence, Rhode Island. That's the TV station where she was producing the weather graphics.
They said, oh my God, we've heard about this new thing, Ted Turner, Atlanta, cable, and we've even heard that there's some British accents there, which there were. So I went down there. I mean, I did an interview by phone. They called me up and they asked me 10 questions, one of which was, what's the capital of Iran? And since I'd grown up there, I knew that it was Tehran. And it always makes me laugh that, but it was in the middle of the hostage crisis and, it was a big deal in America at that time. So I went down to Atlanta with my bicycle, my $100 and my suitcase, and they wanted me to be an electronic graphics operator there as well, which I didn't want to be. And when I got down there, the head recruiter, I remember it was a mom and pop operation. I'm not being disrespectful, but it was a startup at the time. And there were very few people, and they really recruited everybody they could, mostly young university graduates who decided to do graduate school on the job as opposed to,
paying tuition.
Exactly. And so, they needed young, eager blood who they didn't have to pay very much. And so the recruiter said to me, oh, you're foreign. We got a vacation. We got an opening on the foreign desk. So I thought, well, okay, that's my very bad American accent. So I went onto the foreign desk, and from there I moved my way up. I scrubbed the desk. I took in international feeds and scripts from reporters. I learned on the job. Unfortunately, my boss was a woman who was not supportive. So I had to power through that, and I did. And then I came in on my own time, and I wanted to work on weekends and learn how to write for the anchors, so I started to do that. And then I said, well, if I fly myself there, can I work for X and Y? And the first time I did that was a year after joining CNN, and it was the first presidential conventions that I had ever attended. So it was the Democrats in San Francisco in 1984, and then the Republicans in Dallas again in 1984. And that was a remarkable experience. So I kept accumulating experience, mostly on my own dime and on my own time, but then I would get, opportunities which then came up until I finally became a foreign correspondent. But it was all like that. It was all, I'll do this, I'll do that, take me, do this, blah, blah. Pain in the ass.
But what is it? You have a boss who's telling you that you're not really cut out for this.
I don't know how else to describe myself. I'm just persistent.
Where does that come? You just seem to have confidence and faith that, okay, I'm not going to listen to that.
So maybe let's go back to my childhood. I was raised in a great family that gave me confidence. I was raised the eldest of 4 girls, to an Iranian father, a British mother, in a patriarchy. But I was never told that girls couldn't do anything. It just never occurred to me that I couldn't do anything. But at the same time, I wasn't entitled. I don't feel arrogant. I don't feel it was my due. I really believe that it is what I've always done. I've worked hard for stuff, and I've wanted stuff, and I've done it. I've done stuff.
When you think your father lived to 101, I was lucky enough to meet him. What an impressive man. What was he like?
My father was a really interesting, highly educated, multilingual, very moderate Iranian man who had the good fortune at the time, and we're going back to the early 1900s when he was born, to be educated in a small group of privileged people in Tehran. There was only a small group, it was a very undeveloped country at that time. The majority of people were poor, lived in the hinterlands. My father was very well educated, was able thereafter to go abroad and get a law education in France, never practiced as a lawyer. My father was the opposite of a driven professional who drove his family to follow in his footsteps. He was exactly the opposite. Now, that's good and bad. He though gave me a huge amount of space to be who I am and what I wanted to be. My mother as well was somebody who allowed us to be ourselves. And I think that perhaps is the greatest gift that parents can give.
You became the face of this network, especially in the Gulf War, because that's what people remembered, right? We had it in our living rooms. in a way we'd never had it before. And you had to work all the time. What was that like? I mean, you must have been exhausted. You were worried. It was dangerous.
So again, I was really lucky. I filled a series of dead man's shoes or dead women's shoes. I entered certain jobs way ahead of my expertise, and I became a foreign correspondent, basically because one of my colleagues did not want to take a job that was open in Frankfurt, at the CNN bureau in Frankfurt at that time. And I went, I'll go. And they were so desperate, they had nobody to go. And this was in the spring of 1990, that they said, okay, go on, we're Frankfurt, who cares about Frankfurt? Anyway, so I go. I never really settle into Frankfurt because a couple of months later, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, August 2nd, 1990. And I went, I'll go. And they go, no. All the other experienced guys will be going to Baghdad and Saudi and trying to get into Kuwait and this and that. Of course, they couldn't because all the planes were not going to those places. So I gathered my little team in Frankfurt and we got on a plane to Dubai, which is essentially the closest we could get to the action on August 2nd, 1990. And that's where we all started reporting on the invasion by Saddam Hussein of Kuwait. Then we started to go into Saudi Arabia and Baghdad and elsewhere. So I was put in Saudi Arabia. Imagine, girl, 2 women associates, a camera woman and a sound woman. We were three women, the only all-women team in the most misogynistic, most patriarchal country when it came to women's rights in the world at that time. And in Saudi Arabia, they looked at us as we were nuts. What's CNN doing? How could they send all these women? But it turned out that in itself distinguished us as a team, distinguished CNN, and because we had the technological ability to have portable satellites and live around the clock, I became a constant presence on television around the world. And because it was the very first introduction of CNN in a major way to the world, not just to the United States, but to the world, given this war was happening, I sort of grew with CNN. So CNN and myself, I consider, we grew at the same time. We had our coming out party, if you like.
When you were saying, you raised your hand, I'll go to Frankfurt, I'll do the war. What is it in you that causes you to raise your hand?
At first, I think a sense of adventure and a sense of, wow, this is my dream coming true. This is what I wanted to do. I went to university for this reason. I got my first, internships, my first jobs, all, with great focus. To be able to tell those stories around the world of revolution, which I had experienced at home and in my family.
And you have been in all of the hot spots of the world, from Somalia to Sudan to Rwanda, North Korea. But when we think of you, I think you really changed history in a way when you were in Bosnia.
Yes.
And you spent years there in bad conditions. Just first of all, place us there. You were in hotels with no electricity, no water, but you really were informing the world.
Bosnia was the war that happened after the Gulf War. So the Gulf War was a set piece that people recognized and understood. You had 500,000 US-led coalition troops which were going to push out an invader from another country. So it was a set piece. Army against army, air against air, etc. Bosnia and the Balkans were the first of our modern world's war against civilians. So it was from the beginning a human rights crisis. It was from the beginning ethnic cleansing, which led to genocide. It was from the beginning a massive humanitarian catastrophe. And from the beginning, a complete dereliction and abdication of duty by our democratic nations. That took me a long time to understand. Because when you go into that as a young journalist, which I was, relatively inexperienced, except for the first Gulf War, it takes you a while to understand what you're actually confronting. And then, once you've understood it, and you've started to report on it, and you're reporting the truth, then you're confronted with other people projecting onto you. You're biased, you're taking sides, you've forgotten what objectivity means, etc. So that's what happened to me.
This woman gave birth to a baby on Christmas Day, but it was not a joyful occasion.
No one can force me to take this child. If someone forces me to keep it, I will kill it myself.
She gave her baby up for adoption because it was conceived in hate, not love. She is one of the countless Bosnian Muslim women who say they were raped by Serb soldiers. In Bosnia and in refugee camps in Croatia, Muslim women say they were used until they became pregnant. They were told they would bear Serb children. Many were not released until it was too late to have abortions. The mother of this baby says she was raped. She has deserted the child, and hospitals in Sarajevo and Croatia report a marked increase in the number of abandoned babies.
I saw what was going on in Sarajevo, in Srebrenica, in Gorazde, in all these towns that became synonymous with genocide in Bosnia. And I could tell, it didn't take much, that this was one side, heavily armed and backed by a foreign power, Serbia, Bosnian Serbs, attacking another side for their ethnicity and as a land grab and as a way to move people out of land that they wanted to seize and create their own rump state. That's classic ethnic cleansing, which then when you add mass slaughter to it, it's genocide. And we recognized that, and we told that story, and the West didn't want to hear it, much less the Serbs, but the West didn't want to hear it. So the easy way was to blame the journalists for going native, excuse me using that language, but that's what they said, for taking sides with the Muslims.
Who was telling you that?
There were leaders in the rest of the world saying that. There's an article that for me was formative, which was done on me for the New York Times Magazine, in which one of my colleagues said, Christiane has lost her objectivity, something like that, which actually, again, was formational for me and foundational because it forced me again early to examine what objectivity meant.
And that's led to what you have famously said is when you are neutral, you're an accessory. And who wants to be an accessory to genocide?
I did say that, and then I've sort of solidified to that. I've sort of focused my mantra to truthful, not neutral. And that, again, is born out of a huge amount of experience after Bosnia, whether it's on climate change, there is no both-siderism. Whether it's on populism and demagoguery, whether it's on the vaccines during a public health global pandemic, there is no both-siderism. We absolutely have to understand where the truth is and tell that truth, and that is objectivity. So I, coming to this, was in some distress because I considered myself, I hoped that I was a good journalist, that I was being objective and that I was telling the truth. But when my own colleagues started to criticize me, not to mention leaders in the other part of the world that didn't want to do anything about this, Bosnia, I had to say to myself, well, I'm not going to create a false neutrality, a false equivalence between victim and aggressor, between fact and lie. And that has been my guiding principle ever since. And I'm really glad that it happened to me early.
But because of your work there, eventually, even if slow, other journalists started following you and kind of showing the world, putting a spotlight on the evil of Milosevic and the war crimes that were happening there. I mean, that must make you feel good.
It does, but I don't think I was there alone or first. You know, I was there with a big group of colleagues from all the other networks, all the other newspapers, and most journalists got it. There were a few who didn't, but most did. And they paid for it, many, with injuries, with their lives. Again, I'm very lucky. I always touch wood that I survived unscathed in terms of physically. You never survive unscathed emotionally because it's a big burden. But I think we did a very good job because we told the truth. And finally, the United States led an intervention that ended the war very, very quickly and brought a peace that to this day has lasted. And furthermore, did a preemptive humanitarian intervention in next-door Kosovo a few years later, so that before it could get to genocide, the US, Britain, others intervened to prevent the Serbs from massacring the Kosovar Albanian majority there. And the peace has lasted to this day. The flip side to that is when we're not there, it allows what happened in Rwanda.
Because a lot of bad things happen when it's in the dark, in the back rooms, and your whole life has been bring the camera there, ask the tough questions. You had said something about it was heartbreaking that so many Americans were watching the O.J. Simpson trial instead of realizing that 3 million people were getting killed in Rwanda. When you look back at that, what should have happened?
So O.J. Simpson and all that was going on. It was 1 million who were killed in some 3 months in Rwanda, and it was a terrible juxtaposition. It was all happening in the same time in the mid to late 90s, where there was just so much foreign policy happening, and cameras were directed very, clearly at some places like Bosnia, like Somalia, where you had Black Hawk Down, which was catastrophic for the US. Like the good news story in Africa, South Africa, the release and the election of Nelson Mandela was 1994, at a similar time that Africans were being massacred in Rwanda. And not enough journalists in enough what I call throw weight or tipping point numbers, critical mass, were there to hold the West's feet to the fire and to demand accountability. And so in a matter of 3 months, with pre-industrial tools, which were machetes and clubs, one ethnic group in Rwanda massacred another one. So 800,000 to 1 million people in 3 months in a pre-industrial level of violence. And it was grotesque. And you know what? That part of the world is still paying for it. And the West is still paying for it. Somebody like Paul Kagame, who's now been in power ever since, will say, don't you talk to me about democracy. Where were you when we were being massacred? It comes back to haunt you as well if you don't do the right thing in the end. And I'm talking about world powers.
Just looking at you now, the passion that you bring to this, what keeps you up at night now? Are you worried that there's something that's kept in the dark that we should be illuminating, we being journalists?
What keeps me up at night right now today is the fall of Afghanistan. That is a shame of massive proportions. The United States and its allies reluctantly, because NATO couldn't stay without the United States, literally handed Afghanistan back to a fundamentalist, Islamic, terrorist organization against whom they went to war 20 years ago.
What should they have done?
They should have had a contingency plan. They should have, if they wanted to end the forever war, they should have had a plan B. They should have kept control of the air power. They should have been able to use air power against a rapid Taliban advance. Most importantly, they should have not said yes to every Taliban demand at the so-called peace talks in Doha, Qatar, where the Taliban was saying one thing around the table and doing another thing on the ground. So that we're now faced with a Taliban which has never governed. It's never governed, it simply imposed its dictatorial regime on a country for several years before 9/11. It devastated the future of women and girls, the future of young people who wanted something other than war and wanted something close to peace and freedom. And, it spread terrorism. It was a safe haven, as we all know, for terror and for Al-Qaeda, which launched the attack on the United States.
Do you plan on going over there?
I'd like to go. We'll see. I'd like to go. But we've seen this movie before. Obama and Biden pulled out of Iraq in 2011, thinking, campaign promise, I'm going to pull out of Iraq to allow ISIS to take over northern Iraq and then Syria, which then forced the US to reintroduce thousands more troops and for many years conduct a ultimately successful air campaign to end the caliphate. Within a couple of years of ending ISIS caliphate, they have now offered another caliphate in the middle of the Middle East region, Southeast Asia, in Afghanistan, to Taliban. It is indescribably devastating. And on top of everything else, all the people who helped the United States, the Afghans who put their lives on the line to be translators, to put themselves between the US forces and the other internationals and harm's way, many of them, most of them will not get out. And they will be left to perish. And it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. And women, what's going to happen to women? Are we going to believe the Taliban? We have no idea how it's going to turn out, except for how they were before.
You have been in all these places, and I just wanted to read something about that you wrote. You gave a speech in 2000, and you said, I rarely talk about this, because frankly, it's impossible to talk about. But I ask you in this room tonight whether you know what it must be like to spend all your working life scared. Scared of being shot, of being kidnapped, of being raped by some lunatic who may not want your story, or may blame you for bringing NATO bombs down on them. I manage the fear, but it certainly takes its toll. The strain does. And so there's the horror of what we see in Rwanda, piles of bodies that are lifted by bulldozers after a genocide and simply dumped into a mass graves. I saw the toughest of soldiers who had to supervise this crying. In Bosnia, little children shot in the head by a guy who thinks it's okay to aim his gun at a child. And in Somalia and Ethiopia, the walking skeletons that heralded and signaled those terrible famines. So you wrote that, you said that at a speech. What is the toll all this has taken on you?
It's exactly as you've just read. It's a very, very hard thing to live your life witnessing, processing, and living with. I would say that the way I could process it was by telling the stories. The way I survived that, along with so many others, and you can read biographies from so many photographers and other reporters who've seen similar stuff, my generation, before my generation. It's a belief that if you can at least tell the story, or you convince yourself that if you can at least tell the story, at least you're contributing something positive and constructive.
But when you're all the time, as you have been for years, genocide, mass slaughter, evil, some really evil people.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with it? I mean, just practically, do you exercise? Do you call somebody? Do you like?
No, there was nobody to call.
Is there some magic potion?
No,
that you
there's
can
no magic potion. Number one, I manage the fear. So I've never said I wasn't afraid. I manage fear. Number two, and I think your audience might think, oh, it's the adrenaline junkie, it's the addiction to war, it's all that kind of stuff. I don't like that. I reject that kind of banal description of what gets us through. Because, of course, adrenaline gets us through, because that is physically what that hormone is. I mean, adrenaline is fight or flight, right? It's actually something physical that has a known physical impact on your body and your behavior. So if it hadn't been for adrenaline, at the moment, I might not have escaped that sniper or ran across that road or ducked at the right time or whatever it is. So physically, yes. Emotionally, it has a much longer term impact, and it only unfolds over time, and you only process it over time, often not in the moment, but later. And I would say that I wrote that speech in 2000, and I just had my child several months earlier, Darius, my son, who's now 21. And I would say being a mother and having a different emotional platter and a different sort of personal life and personal responsibilities and joy came at exactly the right time for me. So that even though I'd continued to do this work, I also had other priorities. When I was not married and I was not a mother, I could gamble with my own life. And I wouldn't gamble with other people's lives, but I could have a less important view of the value of my own life. And I do not think that I could have done that work had I had a child. There's no way. There's no way. I would have just wanted to stay alive and safe and sane for my child. That would have been my primal instinct.
But just let me ask you, because so many people, when they see really horrible things like genocide and little kids getting killed, do you believe in God?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, Look, I was raised a Catholic. I went to Catholic schools. My mother's a very, very deep believer. And I've basically spent my life covering religious, political, ethnic conflict. So what I believe in is the ability for everyone to coexist. I'm religious for sure, but am I a fundamentalist? No. Am I an orthodox? No. I have my own set of religious beliefs, and I live with that. I also believe that God or no God, we people have free will, and what we do with our free will is as important. And that is on us, and that is our moral and humanitarian responsibility and mission, And I think that one of the things that I believe form the parameters of what I cover is the use and the misuse of power. Conversely, how that affects the dignity of human beings. And I focus on that, and whether it's out of the barrel of a gun or through the pulpit or whatever it is, the misuse of power through religious, political, military means is so profound. And it's something I focus on so greatly, not just on a global scale, but even in the household, even in the workplace, even in schools. Power is something that I never understood until I covered it every day, is formative. And as I say, it goes hand in hand with the impact that has on the dignity and the rights of each and every human being. So if you want to call it God's will, God's view, humankind's, call it whatever you will, but the results are the same.
You're so known for your interviews. Famously, Yasser Arafat hung up on you in a telephone interview at a key moment, and I'll never forget the look on your face on TV, because he just went, "What? You can't talk to Yasser Arafat like
General
that."
Arafat! Boom, hang up. And I'm standing there on the walls of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, and it was 2002. Ariel Sharon had decided to reinvade the West Bank, and in response to a series of suicide bombings by the Palestinians inside Israel. And I think I asked him, so do you accept any responsibility? And he just went ballistic. And I felt that I was blushing on global television and very, very embarrassed, but c'est la vie.
Mr. Arafat, I'm asking you simply a question. Are you able to rein in the violence?
You have to be accurately when you are speaking with General Yasser Arafat. Be quiet.
Mr. Arafat, what did you make of Colin Powell's statement? How did
you are covering with these questions, these terrorist activities of the Israeli occupation and the Israeli crimes? Be fair. Not to make these fatal mistakes.
Can I ask?
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, you just heard a very angry and emotional Yasser Arafat. We have asked him...
How has being a woman in this field, you're often with presidents and ambassadors and diplomats, and you're often the only soldiers, a lot of soldiers, because you've been in war zones. How has it helped or not helped?
So I always say, and it's a little bit twee and a little bit of a catchphrase now, it's just like being a man except better. You can get into so many places where men can't. For instance, particularly in the post-9/11 world, right, where it's all been about Islamic fundamentalism and this and that and various cultural realities that we've had to try to penetrate to understand what's going on. And I have actually been allowed to get past and to punch through that what would on the surface be and is misogyny, a complete, disregard for women's rights or their right to even exist, and get into, for instance, the homestead, get into people's homes and workplaces and hospitals and wherever it's necessary to tell the stories of the civilians. And that's really been what I've done mostly. Yes, I have a program now in which I interview world leaders and important people and this and that, but I believe my career, if I'm going to be proud of it, is that I spent most of my career telling the story of ordinary people. And that to me is what the news is, because they're the ones who live with the effects of what world leaders decide to rain on them. I don't know who wrote this, but recently I came across this quote. Our job is not to make up anybody's mind, but to make the agony of decision-making so intense that you can only escape by thinking. And I believe there's a serious lack of thinking that goes on in much of our daily endeavors, in the creation of policy and this and that. So if I can make people think before they take asinine or good decisions, that would be great. So when people say, we think we can change the world, or it's the world according to whatever, CNN, blah, 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 no. I want to help other people think about what they're doing on behalf of humankind, basically.
You know, a lot of people don't understand what a foreign correspondent is. I was one for 15 years running around the world, and it's often not very glamorous. Let's talk about a typical day on a busy news day when you were in Bosnia. How many hours do you work? What are the conditions?
Well,
bring
first
us
of all,
there.
Bosnia is anything but typical because you're running gauntlets of sniper fire.
But you spent years there, so I mean a regular day among those years. What was it like?
So a foreign correspondent is like a pen pal, right? So somebody's out there writing letters home to tell people what's happening. And it just so happens that if you're in a newspaper or radio or television, or whatever, you're telling a lot more people about what's happening where you are. So I guess a typical day in the height of the worst moments of siege and slaughter, I'm sorry, that's what we witness, slaughter on a daily basis, is, you know, it goes from the banal to the brutal and back and forth. And you get up, you're in a hotel, it was called the Holiday Inn, which happened to have some international renown because Sarajevo had been the site of the Winter Olympics in 1984.
But how do you get information? You're there,
'Cause we're
sometimes there's no
journalists.
connection, you have a satellite phone. I mean,
Well, it's before social media and before massive internet and before, you know, we certainly didn't have a satellite dish. We weren't live all the time, not like talking heads and panels on TVs that you see right now. We actually left our hotel rooms and went and told the stories and gathered the news. That's what we did. That's why so many people were injured and killed, so many journalists. And it was the first conflict in our modern time where journalists were deliberately targeted. And that's important to remember because what they saw in this essentially end of the 20th century satellite age was what was happening. So the baddies sitting in Serbia, or even across the lines in Pale, where the Bosnian Serbs were, could see what we were saying in Sarajevo in real time, in their backyard, and they didn't like it. So they decided to silence us. So they physically, deliberately targeted us. And we've seen that simply increase since the Bosnian War to now. The leading cause of death amongst foreign correspondents is deliberate killing. Unlike any other sector of society. That is the leading cause of death and injury. So we internalize that, and each, I guess, week, month, year, we take greater precautions. There was no such thing as bulletproof vests before Bosnia, or helmets, or armored cars. Bosnia started that. For instance, after my colleague Margaret Moth was shot in the face, and her jaw was, you know, shot off, and then another colleague, David Kaplan from ABC, was shot through what we called a soft skin car, i.e. an unarmored car, on his way from Sarajevo airport. We gradually protected ourselves more and more, so that was one aspect. But there was no substitute for going out and reporting the news. I mean, I remember one famous day, I just thought it would be cool on a Sunday in 1992, which was kind of the beginning, to go out and do a story on the zoo in Sarajevo. We'd heard that the zookeepers had been chased out, that they couldn't get there, that it was on a front line, too dangerous, animals starving. Who doesn't like an animal story? So myself, my camerawoman, producer, we went there. Obviously they could see us in the hills, and so the Serbs started to bombard and mortar the zoo. And I remember sitting in a door.
Specifically knew it was you and CNN.
I don't know whether they knew it was CNN. They knew it was journalists and cameras. And we sat in a door jam, thinking like an earthquake that would protect us. And I just remember saying to my team, I'm sorry, I swear to God, if we get out of here alive, I'll never do this to you again, never bring you to a dangerous place again, never, sorry. That's all I could think of to say, like a mantra. And then they stopped firing and we ran out and we got into our cars and we left, and we did similar things the next day. We were young, We had a sense of immortality, we had a sense of mission, and we kept doing our job.
How has, right now, a lot of people are talking about the distrust of the media. The Trump administration called journalists the enemy of the people. And when you and I went into this field, we felt like it was a pillar of democracy, right? Knowledge is power. You've got to inform the people. How do you see journalism now, and where are we heading?
So for me, one of the most painful things is the disrespect and the suspicion of something which I thought was as empirical as truth, the concept of truth. And that if you just went out there and found it and witnessed it and recorded it and then told it, then people would say, yeah, that's the truth, and let me make my decisions around those facts. Well, the facts, as we know, have been roundly assaulted, disparaged, and disrespected in a way that has shattered many ordinary people's faith in facts and truth. And I think that is one of the most dangerous concepts of humankind. Again, somebody once said, we can't all have the same opinions, but we do all have the same set of facts. And that has always been the foundational, premise of news and information, and that is at great risk right now. I hope that it'll reach a plateau and then start leveling off, and that people will come back to the concept of empirical truth and scientific facts. But it's very difficult to stomach when people come up to you and say, oh my God, I don't know where to go for the truth. And I'm like, what? We spent decades building brands that are associated and aligned with the concept of truth and facts. Obviously, propaganda has been around since time immemorial, but this electronically aided assault on truth, i.e. bots and algorithms and interference and hacking and all that kind of stuff, has made it much, much more difficult for us. Plus you have, again, not just dictators and autocrats, but you've got Democrats also pissing all over the truth. Sorry for my language.
You mean in democratic countries, not just
like
the Democratic Party?
Yeah, no, I don't mean the Democratic Party. I'm not an American. I talk about Democrats with a small d. But the world of if the democratic world loses faith in democratic values, of which truth is one, then it's much more difficult for us to hold the line. But I think you can tell that ever since this wholesale assault on our values, you've had phenomenal journalism which has held the line and which has succeeded. I think that's a hopeful sign, and I'm going to hang on to that.
Our heartfelt thanks to Christiane Amanpour. She is the chief international anchor for CNN, where she also hosts the nightly interview program Amanpour. On PBS, she's the host of Amanpour and Company. She has won the Peabody, the DuPont, the Polk, and the Edward R. Murrow Awards, along with more than a dozen Emmys, and just about every other journalism prize there is. Christiane Amanpour spoke with Mary Jordan for the Academy of Achievement. And before we go, I urge you to take a listen to our episode on Ted Turner, the visionary founder of CNN and the man who changed the face of news. I'm Alice Winkler, and this is What It Takes from the Academy of Achievement. What It Takes is generously funded by the Catherine B. Reynolds Foundation. Many thanks to them and to you for joining us today. See you next time.